Hello everyone, I am Estella, and I am 34 years old. I arrived at my parents' house in Portland, Oregon on my birthday, expecting a surprise celebration filled with warmth and laughter. What I encountered instead was a transformed living room lined with rows of chairs holding nearly 220 family members and friends, all seated as though attending a formal hearing. My mother immediately began taking down the framed photographs from the wall that chronicled my life. She then turned to the room and started to speak about the sacrifices the family had made. My father supported her by providing additional details from a stack of papers he held. To understand how that afternoon came to pass, and why I ultimately chose to walk away from the only family I had ever known, I need to go back and share the complete story from its earliest chapters. Portland, Oregon, with its misty mornings, towering evergreen trees, and steady rhythm of rain, shaped much of who I became. In our home, my parents held very specific expectations about achievement and loyalty. My father had constructed his real estate company through years of relentless effort, starting from a tiny office and expanding it into a name recognized across the region. He evaluated success strictly through contracts signed and buildings acquired. My mother, who had once enjoyed a career in education before stepping away to manage our social life and community, standing fully aligned herself with his vision of what mattered most. From the time we were small, it was evident that my older brother Dylan occupied the center of their world. At 38, 4 years ahead of me, Dylan possessed the easy confidence and social ease they valued above all else. He excelled in sports during high school and carried himself with the assurance of someone destined to inherit and expand the family enterprise. I, by contrast, found my happiness in quiet pursuits, losing myself in stories, and offering help wherever I could. When I turned 17 and earned a full scholarship to the university's teacher preparation program, I stood on the award stage searching the audience for any sign of my parents. They had decided that attending one of Dylan's key athletic competitions took priority that afternoon, and my mother later described the scheduling conflict as unavoidable. Finishing my training and receiving my teaching credentials at 23 represented a hard-won personal milestone. I completed the program with top honors, eager to step into a classroom and guide children as they discovered their own abilities. Sharing this achievement at home brought only a familiar wave of disappointment from my mother, who remarked that pursuing business studies the way Dylan had initially intended would have positioned me to contribute meaningfully to the company. The fact that Dylan had abandoned his own business coursework after roughly 18 months never seemed to factor into their assessment. Their focus remained fixed on the path I had not taken. Once I began working as a third-grade teacher at a neighborhood school in Portland, my days filled with meaningful moments that sustained me. I watched students who arrived shy and uncertain gradually open up, celebrate when a child who had struggled with letters finally read an entire page aloud without assistance, and felt genuine pride when the class worked together on a project that sparked their curiosity about the world. While I invested myself in nurturing these young minds and creating a safe space for learning, Dylan continued to live at a faster pace, often spending without restraint, and later becoming entangled in high-risk financial decisions. My parents never questioned the contrast. In their eyes, he stayed their favored son, and I remained the daughter whose accomplishments fell short of their hopes. I responded by learning to hold my tongue during family meals and holidays, convincing myself that preserving calm was more important than voicing my feelings. The repeated message at every gathering was that real acceptance required aligning myself more closely with Dylan. I made myself smaller, quieter, and more agreeable, believing this approach would eventually earn their regard. Yet one person in our extended family offered unwavering support without any demand that I change. That person was my grandfather David. Grandfather David resided in a modest home tucked away on the outskirts of Portland, where the trees grew thicker and the sounds of the city faded into the background. His garden tended with patient care, and the comfortable chairs on his porch became my refuge whenever I could escape for a visit. He listened without interruption as I described my classroom experiences and the quiet fulfillment I found in teaching. When I admitted that I had deliberately chosen education over any role in my father's real estate business, he clasped my hands and assured me that helping shape the next generation ranked among the most honorable paths a person could follow. His steady belief in my choices gave me the resolve to continue even when approval at home remained elusive. Approximately 4 years before the events I am describing, when I had just turned 30, grandfather David received news that altered everything. Physicians diagnosed an advanced form of cancer and indicated he might have 24 months ahead of him, perhaps slightly more, if treatment progressed well. My parents reacted by exploring professional care arrangements and considering whether a residential facility would offer the most practical solution. Dylan expressed the view that placing him in such a setting would reduce complications for the entire family. I found the idea impossible to accept. The prospect of him facing his remaining time in an impersonal environment without familiar faces nearby felt wrong on every level. Shortly after learning the diagnosis, I submitted my resignation at the school, where I had taught for several fulfilling years, packed my belongings, and moved into his house to provide care directly. The following 4 years unfolded as a time of deep presence and shared understanding. I mastered the routine of his medications, learned to anticipate when pain would disrupt his rest, and spent long hours simply sitting beside him when words were unnecessary. We passed many afternoons on that porch, sometimes beneath the soft Portland rain, exchanging stories about his earlier life, the values he held dear, and the quiet strength that comes from recognizing your inherent worth. He often told me that true resilience meant holding on to your sense of self, even when those closest to you seem to overlook it. In his company, I rediscovered confidence I had buried beneath years of trying to fit an image that was never mine. Throughout those years, Dylan found time to visit on only 2 occasions. My parents appeared at intervals of several weeks, but typically departed after brief conversations, citing other obligations that required their attention. With grandfather David, every interaction carried weight and authenticity. He offered me the acceptance I had sought elsewhere for so long, and in return, I gave him the companionship and attention he deserved during his most vulnerable period. The 4 years I spent caring for grandfather David passed in a blur of quiet routines and deepening bonds, but they came to an end far sooner than any of us had hoped. 7 months before my 34th birthday, he slipped away peacefully in his sleep, while I held his hand just as we had spent so many nights together. The house that had become my sanctuary suddenly felt too large and too empty. At the funeral held under Portland's characteristic gray skies with rain misting the windows of the small chapel, my mother pulled me aside afterward. She told me not to act as though I had given up everything, insisting that it was not as if he had left me anything of value anyway. I said nothing in response because I did not yet understand how mistaken she was. Grandfather David had prepared something far more significant than anyone in the family realized at the time, and they were already beginning to circle around it like people who sensed an opportunity. The first clear warning arrived exactly 1 week before my birthday. I was finishing up some lesson planning at the kitchen table in my apartment when my phone rang. Dylan's name appeared on the screen, and that alone surprised me because he almost never called. When I answered, his voice carried an unusual sweetness that immediately put me on edge. "Stella," he said, drawing out my name in a way that felt rehearsed. "Have you received any mail from a lawyer recently? Something concerning grandfather's estate?" I frowned at the papers in front of me and told him no, asking why he wanted to know. He paused for a moment before continuing in that same overly pleasant tone. He and our parents had been talking, he explained, and they had decided it was time to make things right by throwing me a surprise birthday party at the house. The entire family would be there. In 34 years, they had never once organized a birthday celebration for me. So the idea left me momentarily speechless. He added that after everything that had happened with grandfather, the family had grown distant and now wanted to repair those bonds. A small spark of hope flickered inside my chest despite everything I knew about them. Later that same afternoon, I mentioned the call to my best friend Danny while we sat in the teacher's lounge at the school where we both worked. Danny had been my closest colleague and confidant since we started teaching at the same elementary school years earlier. In many ways, he had become the steady support that my own brother had never provided. When I described Dylan's unexpected invitation and the strange question about a lawyer's letter, Danny set down his coffee mug and looked at me with clear concern. He pointed out that our family had never thrown me a birthday party before, so why would they start now? I tried to brush it off, suggesting maybe they felt guilty about how things had gone with grandfather, but Danny shook his head. People rarely change overnight, he said. They simply become better at concealing their true intentions. I told him he was being overly suspicious yet. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could not shake the odd tone in Dylan's voice or the timing of his question about the lawyer. 3 days before the party, I ran into Aunt Ruth at the grocery store near my apartment. Aunt Ruth had always been the outspoken one in the family, the person my parents described as someone who talked too much and did not know her place. In reality, she simply refused to pretend everything was fine when it was not. She grabbed my arm in the produce section and pulled me behind a display of watermelons, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she asked if I knew about Dylan. My stomach tightened. She explained that he was in serious trouble. He and his associate Kyle had poured everything they had into a cryptocurrency investment that a friend had recommended. They had lost nearly $250,000 and were now drowning in debt to banks and personal contacts alike. My father was apparently frantic, trying to locate money from any source to bail Dylan out. Aunt Ruth's grip on my arm tightened as she told me she should not be sharing this, but I deserved to know the truth. The family was not planning a birthday party at all. They were planning something entirely different. When I asked what she meant, she said she did not know the exact details, but they had been holding private meetings about grandfather's estate and something involving a house. She urged me to be careful before disappearing around the corner as quickly as she had appeared. I stood alone among the watermelons with my heart pounding. What could any of this possibly have to do with me? That evening, I checked my mailbox for the first time in weeks. Working long hours at school often meant I overlooked small tasks like collecting mail, and most important documents arrived by email anyway. Buried beneath flyers and credit card offers was a heavy cream-colored envelope from the law offices of Gerald Whitmore. I tore it open right there on the front steps, reading by the light of my phone. The letter requested my presence at their offices to discuss matters related to the estate of David Mitchell. It was addressed only to me. I had assumed grandfather's house would go to my parents, or be divided among everyone, but this letter suggested otherwise. With shaking fingers, I called the number and scheduled an appointment for the day after my birthday. The night before the party, I could not sleep. I lay awake thinking about all the times I had stayed silent to keep the peace. When Dylan turned 16, my father had bought him a brand new car, while I spent 3 years saving for a dependable used one that no one seemed to notice. On several of my birthdays in my mid-20s, my mother had forgotten the date entirely, while Dylan received weekend trips and special outings. At one Thanksgiving gathering a couple of years earlier, Dylan had announced to the whole table that I was only a teacher because I lacked the drive or intelligence for anything more significant. Everyone had laughed and I had smiled and said nothing. Each time I swallowed my voice, I told myself I was being mature and keeping the family together. Lying in the dark that night, I finally understood that every silence had cost me another piece of myself. I reached for the last letter grandfather David had written me and read his familiar words once more. Live like you deserve to. I fell asleep with the paper resting against my chest, unaware that his promise would be tested within hours. On the morning of my birthday, I dressed in a deep green dress that grandfather David had once complimented, saying the color suited me well. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. Cars already lined both sides of the street and spilled onto the neighboring lawns, far more vehicles than I had expected for any simple gathering. I texted Danny before getting out of the car. He replied instantly that he was parked 2 blocks away and would stay close to his phone. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and stopped short. The living room had been stripped of its usual furniture and filled instead with rows of folding chairs, all facing a long table at the far end. Nearly 220 pairs of eyes turned toward me in complete silence. There were no balloons, no cake, no decorations of any kind. Dylan appeared at my side with a smile that did not reach his eyes and guided me forward, telling me everyone was waiting. I asked where the cake was, but he did not answer. He simply led me to stand alone in front of the long table while the crowd watched without a single person wishing me a happy birthday. My mother stood tall at the long table and let her voice carry across the silent room. For 34 years she began, my parents had raised me, fed me, clothed me, paid for my education, and given me every opportunity. She reached for the thick stack of papers my father had placed in front of her and held them up so everyone could see. This document, she continued, contained a complete accounting of every dollar spent on me from the day I was born until I moved out on my own. It included food, medical expenses, school supplies, birthday gifts, and countless other costs. She flipped to the final page, ran her finger down the total, and announced that the sum came to $450,000. A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the crowd of nearly 220 people. Someone coughed. The number hung in the air like an accusation. She fixed her eyes on me and said I had two choices. I could repay every cent, or I could sign away any claim I might have to grandfather David's house. My blood ran cold. I asked what she meant by my claim to the house and reminded her that I had not even opened the letter from the lawyer yet. She waved that detail aside as unimportant and slid a prepared document across the table toward me. Sign it, she said. Give up the house, and the family would forget all about this bill. That was when she turned and walked to the wall where generations of family photographs still hung in their frames. I had grown up glancing at those pictures every day. There were images of family gatherings, holidays, and milestones stretching back decades. My mother reached up and lifted down the first frame, the one showing me at age 5 with a gap-toothed smile. 34 years, she said, in a voice thick with manufactured sorrow. 34 years of raising an ungrateful child. She tore the photograph in half. The sound cracked through the stillness like a gunshot. I could not move or breathe. She grabbed the next frame, my high school graduation portrait, and declared that I was a daughter who thought only of herself. RIP. Then came the photo from my teaching program graduation, a daughter who never appreciated anything the family had given her. RIP. My hands began to tremble when she reached for the picture of grandfather David and me, taken just days before he passed. Both of us were smiling, his hand resting on my shoulder. A daughter, she announced, who had manipulated a dying old man for her own gain. RIP. The pieces drifted to the floor like dry leaves. Nearly 220 people watched in absolute silence. Not one person moved or spoke up. My brother Dylan stepped forward then. He reached into my purse without asking and pulled out my car keys, dangling them in front of my face with a triumphant expression. This, he said, was no longer mine. Our father had already transferred the title into his name because he needed the car more than I did. I looked from my mother standing among the torn photographs to my father, with his hand resting on that stack of papers, to Dylan still holding my keys, and finally to the sea of relatives who had witnessed everything without raising a single objection. I could have cried or begged. Instead, I drew a slow breath and heard grandfather David's steady voice in my mind, reminding me that I was enough, that I always had been. I turned to my father and asked in a calm voice whether he had actually read grandfather David's will. He blinked and asked what I meant. I explained that the will was a legal document and wondered if he had read it himself or simply assumed the house would be divided among the family. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. I kept my tone steady, the same professional calm I used when speaking with concerned parents at school. That was not how legal documents worked, I told him. From the back of the room, Aunt Ruth gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. I looked directly at Dylan and asked how much he owed. His face went pale. I asked again about the cryptocurrency investments and the scheme that had gone wrong. He stammered that he did not know what I was talking about, but the whispers spreading through the crowd told me many people had already heard rumors. My mother stepped closer and insisted this had nothing to do with Dylan. It was about me being selfish. I held up one hand and said no. This was about them attempting to claim something that might not belong to them without even bothering to verify the facts. The room fell into an even deeper silence. I looked once more at the scattered pieces of my childhood on the floor, at the keys still clutched in Dylan's fist, and at the long table where that accounting of $450,000 still lay. Then I looked toward the door. I told them I would not sign anything that night, and certainly not under this kind of public pressure in front of nearly 220 people. My father slammed his palm against the table and declared that if I did not sign, I would no longer be considered part of the family. I stood motionless for a moment, studying the faces turned toward me. Some showed curiosity, others pity, but most simply waited to see what would happen next. As though my humiliation were entertainment for the evening, I reached up and touched the small silver pendant resting against my wrist, the one grandfather David had given me the week before he died. Slowly and deliberately, I unclasped it and slipped it into my pocket close to my heart. They did not deserve to see it anymore. In a voice that carried clearly across the room, I stated that I would not sign any legal document while being publicly ambushed, and I would not stand there while they tried to erase me. My mother's face twisted with anger. "How dare I?" she began, but I cut her off. She had torn my photographs from the wall in front of everyone. My father had demanded payment for raising me. Dylan had taken my car. I had nothing left to lose in that room. I turned and walked toward the door. No one reached out. No one called my name. No one said happy birthday or offered an apology. Nearly 220 people remained silent as I crossed the threshold and stepped outside into the cool Portland evening. Danny's car was waiting exactly where he had promised, 2 blocks away. I climbed into the passenger seat without looking back at the house. He asked gently if I was all right. I stared straight ahead and told him no, but that I would be. He pulled away from the curb without another word. In the rearview mirror, my parents' house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely behind the line of trees. I did not know it in that moment, but leaving that room had been the single best decision I would ever make. It would take 5 days for my family to grasp the full consequences of what they had done that night. Danny dropped me at my apartment after we left my parents' house that night and refused to leave me alone. He settled onto the couch with an extra blanket and pillow, saying he would stay as long as I needed. Neither of us slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of my mother tearing those photographs returned, followed by the sound of the paper ripping and the heavy silence of nearly 220 people who had done nothing. I kept seeing Dylan's hand reaching into my purse for the keys and the look of satisfaction on his face. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made tea, mostly for something to do with my hands. Danny joined me in the kitchen without turning on the main light. We sat at the small table in the glow of the stove hood and drank in silence. He did not tell me everything would be fine. He simply stayed present, and that was enough. By the time the first gray light of morning reached the windows, my phone had vibrated so many times it felt warm against the wooden surface of the nightstand. I picked it up with a sense of dread. 52 missed calls from my father, 41 from my mother, 27 text messages from Dylan, each one more frantic than the last. "Call me back right now. We need to talk. This is important." There were also messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to in years. How could you do that to your parents? Grandfather would be ashamed. You have always been selfish. I read a few of them, then powered the phone off and placed it face down on the kitchen counter, as if hiding it could somehow quiet the chaos outside. Danny was already moving around the kitchen, measuring coffee grounds with the same careful attention he brought to his lesson plans. He made it strong and black, exactly the way I preferred after long days at school. He set a steaming mug in front of me and sat down across the table without asking what I needed or what I was feeling. For a long while, we simply drank our coffee while the rain tapped softly against the window. Eventually, he said they only knew one side of the story. They did not want to know the other side because it would force them to look at themselves. I nodded. The words felt true, but I still could not find any of my own to answer with. That afternoon, I went to the closet and took down the wooden memory box Grandfather David had given me during his final weeks. It was a simple rectangular box with a sliding lid, the wood darkened by years of handling. Inside, he had placed letters he had written over the decades, faded photographs of him and my grandmother when they were young, a few small objects that had held meaning for him, and the pocket watch he had carried every day of his working life. I lifted each item out slowly, setting them on the table one by one. The familiar scent of old paper and faint cedar rose from the box. At the very bottom, beneath everything else, I found a plain envelope with my name written across the front in his shaky but unmistakable handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the creases soft from being folded and unfolded many times. I sat down at the table and began to read. "My dearest Stella," the letter began. "By now, you have probably discovered that things are not going the way your parents expected them to. Do not worry, sweetheart. I have taken care of everything. They will try to take what I have left you. Do not let them. Mr. Whitmore knows every detail and will explain it all when the time comes. Trust him." I read the words 3 times, letting each sentence settle. He had known. Even while he was still with me, he had understood exactly how my family would behave once he was gone, and he had made preparations so I would not be left defenseless. The knowledge brought a fresh wave of grief mixed with something that felt almost like gratitude. He had seen me clearly until the very end. I looked across the table at Danny, the letter still trembling slightly between my fingers. "I think I need to go see that lawyer," I said quietly. Danny reached over and placed his hand over mine for a moment. "We can go first thing tomorrow morning, if that is what you want." I nodded. For the first time since walking out of my parents' house the night before, the tight knot in my chest loosened just a little. Grandfather David had not only loved me without conditions during his life, he had also made sure that love would continue to protect me after he was gone. The family I had been born into had tried to strip me of everything in front of an audience. The family I had chosen, people like Danny, and the memory of my grandfather were the ones helping me find my footing again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I returned the other items to the memory box one by one, closing the lid with gentle hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall over Portland, steady and unhurried. Inside the apartment, the silence felt different now, less heavy and more like the quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed. I did not know yet what the lawyer would tell me, or how much of Grandfather David's plan would survive whatever came next, but I knew I would not face it alone, and that knowledge was enough to let me breathe fully for the first time in days. The next morning, Danny drove me across town to the offices of Gerald Whitmore. I sat in the passenger seat with Grandfather David's letter tucked safely in my bag, my fingers tracing the edge of the envelope whenever the car stopped at a light. The rain had lightened to a soft drizzle that made Portland's streets glisten. Danny parked in front of an old brick building with tall windows and told me he would wait right there. If I needed him to come inside at any point, all I had to do was text. I thanked him, took a deep breath, and walked through the heavy wooden door. The reception area smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. A kind-looking assistant led me down a short hallway to a corner office where Gerald Whitmore rose from behind a large desk to greet me. He was an older gentleman with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the calm, steady presence of someone who had guided many families through difficult times. He shook my hand warmly and invited me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Your grandfather spoke of you often," he said, as he settled back into his own chair. "I've been expecting your visit." He opened a drawer and withdrew a thick legal document bound with ribbon and marked with official seals. The pages looked heavy with importance. He placed it on the desk between us and began to explain in a gentle but direct voice. Grandfather David had left his house to me and to me alone, not to be shared or divided among the rest of the family. The reason, Whitmore said, was simple. For 4 years, I had been the one who showed up every single day. I had left my teaching position, moved into the house on the edge of town, and provided care without asking for anything in return. No one else in the family had visited more than a couple of times during that entire period. Grandfather had wanted the person who had given the most to receive what he had left behind. The house itself, Whitmore continued, was currently valued at approximately $700,000. It belonged to me, free and clear. There were no liens, no outstanding claims, and no conditions other than one important protection he had built into the will. If any member of the family ever attempted to coerce, threaten, pressure, or manipulate me into surrendering the inheritance, that person would automatically lose any right to claim any other assets Grandfather David might have left. Whitmore allowed himself a small smile as he said my grandfather had been an exceptionally thoughtful man who understood his family very well. I sat in silence for a moment, letting the words settle. The house was mine. The protection was real. Everything my mother, my father, and my brother Dylan had done at that gathering had been based on an assumption they had never bothered to check. Before I could ask any of the questions swirling in my mind, the office door opened quietly. Aunt Ruth stepped inside. She looked tired but relieved, as though she had been carrying a secret for a long time and was finally allowed to set it down. She crossed the room and took the chair beside mine, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Your grandfather asked me to be here when this moment came," she said softly. "I witnessed the signing of the will 4 years ago, right after you moved in with him. He called me one evening and told me Rebecca would never accept his decision. He said you would need someone who understood the truth and would stand in your corner no matter what. He wanted you to know his love had never been tied to money or property. You were the only one who had loved him simply for who he was." Tears came then, but they felt different from the ones I had cried in the days since the birthday gathering. These were tears of release and recognition. Grandfather David had seen everything clearly, even as his body weakened. He had known my family would try to take what he wanted me to have, and he had built safeguards so I could keep it. The public humiliation, the demand for $450,000, Dylan's attempt to claim my car, the flood of desperate calls over the past 5 days, all of it had been an attempt to force me into giving up something that had never been theirs to begin with. Whitmore slid the documents toward me and explained each page in clear, patient language. I signed where he indicated, my handwriting steady, despite the emotions still moving through me. When the last signature was in place, he told me the formal transfer of the deed would be completed within a few weeks. I left his office carrying a folder with copies of everything, the weight of it, both literal and symbolic. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a pale sun was trying to break through the clouds. Danny was still waiting in the car exactly where he had promised. I climbed into the passenger seat and showed him the folder without speaking. He looked at it for a long moment, then started the engine and drove us back through the quiet streets of Portland. For the first time in many years, I felt as though the ground beneath my feet was solid. Grandfather David had given me more than a house. He had given me proof that someone in my family had always seen me clearly and had loved me without conditions. That knowledge was stronger than any document, and it was mine to keep. A few days after the meeting with Gerald Whitmore, I was home alone in my apartment when I heard 3 sharp knocks on the door. I checked the peephole and saw my mother, my father, and my brother Dylan standing in the hallway. They looked tired and tense, like people who had run out of options. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, making it clear they were not invited inside. My mother spoke first, her voice softer than it had been at the birthday gathering. She said she had gotten carried away that night and had been upset. I reminded her that she had torn my photographs off the wall in front of nearly 220 people and called me ungrateful while doing it. She insisted she had not meant it, but the words had already been spoken and witnessed. Dylan pushed forward, then saying he was in real trouble and that if I did not help, he would face consequences I could not understand. I told him that was not my problem to solve. He had made his own choices with the investments just as I had made mine by walking away from a situation that had become unbearable. My father tried a different approach. He said the house should belong to the whole family and that grandfather David would have wanted it that way. I met his eyes and told him grandfather had put his wishes in writing. He had hired a lawyer, made a witness sign, and left the property to me specifically because I had been the one who stayed. That was not an opinion. It was a legal fact. My mother's expression shifted from pleading to anger. She accused me of being heartless and of publicly disowning them on my birthday. I answered calmly that they had demanded $450,000 for the simple fact of my existence and had stood by while my brother took my car. I asked how any of that constituted being family. My father's phone rang in the middle of the conversation. He glanced at the screen and something like dread crossed his face. He answered without stepping away, and I could hear a woman's voice coming through the speaker, loud and angry. It was our Aunt Barbara. She had just spoken with Gerald Whitmore. She demanded to know if it was true that grandfather David had left everything to me and whether there was a clause about coercion. My father tried to say it was complicated, but Barbara cut him off. She had heard what happened at the birthday gathering. 220 people had watched my mother rip apart my childhood, and my father demand payment for raising me. Now the whole family knew the truth, and no one was on their side. She told him he had tried to humiliate his own daughter into giving up an inheritance that had never belonged to him in the first place. Then she hung up. The four of us stood frozen in the doorway. My mother had gone pale. Dylan looked as though he might cry. My father stared at his phone as if it had betrayed him. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and finality. I told them they should leave. I had nothing more to say. My father opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He pocketed the phone, turned, and walked down the hallway without another word. My mother followed, her shoulders slumped. Dylan lingered for a second, his eyes meeting mine with something that might have been shame before he too turned and left. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the wood for a long moment. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of rain beginning again outside. In that silence, I felt something shift inside me. The people who had raised me had tried to break me in front of an audience and had failed. They had come to my door hoping to salvage what they could and had left with nothing. Grandfather David's protection had held. More importantly, the strength he had helped me remember in myself had held as well. I stood up straight, locked the door, and walked back into the living room. For the first time in 34 years, I no longer felt like I was waiting for anyone's permission to matter. A week after the confrontation at my door, I returned to Gerald Whitmore's office. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air and making the room feel calmer, clearer than the last time. I told him I had made my decision. I wanted to keep grandfather David's house, but I had no intention of selling it. Whitmore nodded and pulled out a fresh stack of documents. He asked what I planned to do with the property. I thought about the quiet afternoons on the porch, the stories grandfather had shared, and the way the house had felt like the only place I had ever truly belonged. I told him I would keep it exactly as grandfather had left it, live in it, and take care of it. It felt like the right way to honor him. I signed the ownership papers with a steady hand. Each signature felt like a small, private victory. When I finished, Whitmore mentioned one more matter: the car my brother Dylan had taken. My father had no legal authority to transfer the title because the vehicle had been registered in my name and purchased with my own money. The transfer was invalid. We could file the necessary paperwork to correct the registration and get the car back. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. I told him to proceed. 2 weeks later, a police officer accompanied me to my parents' house to retrieve the car. I had dreaded the moment, expecting another scene. But when we pulled up, the house looked smaller, somehow, less imposing than it had ever seemed in my memory. Dylan met us at the door. He looked as though he had aged 5 years in 5 weeks. His face was drawn and tired. He held out the keys without a word. I took them and said thank you, and I meant it. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps shame or regret, but then his expression hardened and he turned away, disappearing back into the house. I did not see my parents. I did not want to. I walked to the car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway for the last time. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank until it disappeared behind the trees. I did not look back. 1 month later, I moved into Grandfather David's house on the edge of Portland. The little place felt different now, quieter and more completely mine. I spent the first week cleaning every room, organizing the belongings he had left behind, and letting his presence settle around me like a warm blanket. I kept his favorite chair by the front window where he used to sit and watch the birds. I placed his tea set in the kitchen, exactly where he had always kept it. The bird feeder he had filled every morning for decades remained in the garden, and I continued the ritual, scattering seed each dawn. Some things I changed. I painted the bedroom a soft, peaceful color and hung new curtains in the living room that let in more light. Small touches that made the space feel like both of us together. Once I was settled, I spent 3 hours writing one final message to my parents. I told them I did not hate any of them, but I could not continue being treated as though I did not exist. They had disowned me publicly on my birthday. They had demanded payment for raising me. They had stood by while my childhood photographs were torn from the wall. Those were not things I could simply forget or move past. If there ever came a day when they wanted a real relationship, one not based on money or obligation, but on genuine care and respect, they knew how to reach me. Until then, I needed distance. I asked them to please respect that. I hit send, turned off my phone, and did not check for a reply. None came. I was not surprised. Part of me felt relieved. In the weeks that followed, I built a life that finally felt like my own. Danny came over every Saturday evening for dinner. We cooked simple meals in Grandfather's kitchen and talked about school, about the students who were struggling, and the small victories that made teaching worth every difficult day. Aunt Ruth visited on Sunday afternoons. She had become a regular presence, the family connection I had always wished I had. My colleagues from the school, people I had kept at a distance for years, gradually became closer friends than I had ever allowed before. I was not alone. I had family. They simply were not related to me by blood, and somehow that made them even more precious. I stood on Grandfather's porch one evening as the sun set over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold he would have loved. The air smelled of rain and pine. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm figuring it out, Grandpa, just like you said I would." 3 months later, I sat on that same porch with his final letter in my hands. The paper had grown soft from being read so many times. The ink was beginning to fade in places, but the words still landed with the same force as the first time I read them. Live like you deserve to, sweetheart. For 34 years, I had waited for my family to see me, to value me, to love me the way I had tried to love them. I had shrunk myself to fit their expectations, silenced my voice to keep their peace, and given away pieces of my soul every time I let their cruelty slide. It took being publicly ambushed on my birthday in front of nearly 220 people to finally understand what Grandfather David had known all along. I never needed their permission to matter. He had always known that. That was why he left me the house. Not because of its financial value, but because he wanted me to have undeniable physical proof that someone in my family had seen me clearly from the beginning. I was not the ungrateful daughter they had tried to paint me as. I was not the burden or the disappointment. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who loved without conditions or calculations, and that had always been enough. The sun was setting now the same way it had on so many evenings when grandfather and I sat together on this porch. Somewhere in the trees, a bird was singing. I missed him every single day. The breeze picked up rustling through the leaves like a whisper, like an answer I did not need to hear out loud. I folded the letter gently and pressed it to my heart. Thank you, I whispered, for seeing me, for believing in me, and for giving me permission to choose myself. After all, that was what he had really left me. Not a house, permission. That is my story. It was not easy to live or to tell, but I hope it reaches someone who needs to hear that setting boundaries is not selfish. Sometimes it is the only way to survive.